Bryony's thumb was still moving inside Lark's palm. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps, the rhythm she had traced into that small, unresponsive hand every morning for 6 weeks. When the ward door hissed and Underwarden Cass's shadow fell across the cot. Achara, his voice already had the shape of a report he intended to file. Step away from the patient. She didn't. Not yet. She finished the pattern first, 3, pause 2, the old counting rhyme her brother used to tap against her wrist when they hid from the sirens together, a lifetime and a war ago, because if she stopped in the middle it would mean nothing, and 6 weeks of nothing was already more than this ward could stomach. I said step away. I heard you. Bryony set Lark's hand down on the blanket, gently, the way you'd set down something that might still, someday, decide to hold itself. Lark's face didn't change. It never changed. 8 years old and her eyes were open and fixed on absolutely nothing, the pale gray of a screen with no signal, and her chest rose and fell in the shallow, patient rhythm of a girl who had not, by any measure the Cordeth Wardenate's instruments could take, been present behind those eyes in 631 days. Cass's skin had gone the flat, disapproving blue-gray that Iskra skin went when a superior was about to hear about this. Bed 41 is Dormant-Unreachable classified. Unauthorized tactile contact with a Dormant-Unreachable patient is a Tier 2 infraction. You are a provisional laborer on a Tier 1 warning already. I know what she's classified as. Bryony kept her hands where he could see them, empty now, steady. 17 years old, laundry and kitchen rota, a refugee patch on her sleeve instead of a rank bar, and she had learned in the 11 months since Calver's Reach burned that the fastest way to lose an argument with a Wardenate official was to raise your voice. I also know what she was doing 4 days ago. I logged it. You have the log. I have a log I cannot verify, written by someone with no medical standing, describing a grip response that no instrument in this facility recorded. Cass's 4-fingered hand moved to the chart slate at the foot of the bed, more out of habit than need. He had memorized this chart the way you memorize a stone in your shoe. Matron Healer Kell will see you in 20 minutes. Bring your kit. You will not be returning to Ward 7 today. He said it like a small mercy, which, in the Wardenate's accounting, it probably was. Bryony looked past him at the small, unmoving shape in the bed, at the dark hair someone had braided that morning out of habit rather than hope, and made herself say nothing else. Whatever she said next, in this room in front of him, would go into a file. She had learned that too. She reached out one more time, fast, before he could stop her, and pressed her thumb once, hard, into the center of Lark's palm. Their sign for I'm not gone. It was the only word in their whole small invented language that Bryony had never once gotten an answer to. She got none this time either. She let Cass walk her out. The 9th Sanctuary had been an Iskra deepwater research platform once, before the war made it something else. 3 kilometers of gray decking anchored off the coast of a continent nobody on either side had bothered to name for humans. Its long halls converted ward by ward into rows of cots for the children the fighting had hollowed out and left standing, or in Lark's case, left lying very still with her eyes open. Bryony had arrived on a transport 11 months ago with 400 other displaced people from Calver's Reach, had been sorted by a triage officer into asterisk laborer, unskilled, provisional asterisk, and had spent her first 3 weeks scrubbing floors in Ward 2 before someone noticed. She was good with the youngest patients and moved her to 7. Nobody had told her to talk to Bed 41. Nobody had told her not to either, not at first. Dormant-Unreachable patients got baths and feeding tubes and turned over positions to prevent sores, the same mechanical care as furniture. And if a laundry girl wanted to hum to one while she changed the linens, the staff had bigger fires to put out. It was only when Bryony started coming in on her own rest hours, when she started asking the medical staff what the girl's hearing had been like before the blast that took it, that anyone had cared enough to write her up. She remembered the first day clearly, the way you remember any day that turns out, only in hindsight to have been a hinge. She had been changing the bedding in the far corner of Ward 7, 6 weeks and 2 days ago now, working the fitted corner of a sheet under a small, unmoving hip, when Lark's hand had slid off the mattress edge and simply hung there, fingers half curled, exactly the way a hand hangs when nobody inside is minding it. Bryony had reached to tuck it back onto the blanket the way she'd been trained to, reposition limbs to prevent strain dormant-unreachable patients cannot self-correct, and had found herself instead just holding it for a moment. Warm, a pulse in the wrist, ordinary and steady, the pulse of a body that was very much still doing the work of being alive even if nothing behind the eyes was choosing to. She had thought about Ison's hand in hers under the collapsed edge of the co-op storage shed. The raider ships coming in so low and so fast over the fields that the co-op's whole warning system had barely had time to cycle once before the first strike hit the grain silo, the ground going liquid under her feet, Ison's small fingers grabbing hers as they ran because that was what they'd always done, run holding hands, since he was old enough to run at all. She remembered the specific weight of the storage shed's roof coming down between one stride and the next, remembered digging with her bare hands until her nails split, remembered finding his hand first, still holding half of hers, before she found the rest of him and understood there was nothing left to dig for. She had held that hand a long time after, longer than made any sense, long enough that a Wardenate relief officer had eventually had to peel her fingers loose one at a time to get her onto the evacuation transport. And she had spent the better part of the last 11 months believing that the girl who let go of her brother's hand that afternoon was, in some permanent way, someone who had used up whatever she'd once had for holding on. She had thought about how long she had held it after she'd already understood there was no longer anyone on the other end of it to hold back. She had thought, with a clarity that still frightened her a little to remember, I am not doing that again. Not while there's still a pulse. She had traced 3 taps into the base of Lark's thumb without deciding to, the old rhyme, because her hands had needed somewhere to put 40 seconds of memory she didn't have anywhere else to set down. And then she had gone back to the bedding and told herself it meant nothing, and come back and done it again the next day anyway. She hadn't told anyone that part. It didn't fit cleanly into a log entry, and Bryony had learned, in 6 weeks of writing careful clinical-sounding notes for a chart she had no authority to write in, exactly which parts of the truth this Wardenate would take from a laundry girl and which parts it wouldn't. The dormitory she shared with 11 other provisional laborers sat 2 decks below Ward 7, close enough to the waterline that the whole room hummed faintly, day and night, with the sound of the causeway current working against the platform's pilings. An older woman named Ket Solano had the cot next to hers, 40-some years old, a field medic from a border township Bryony had never heard of before the war put them on the same transport, and the closest thing to a mother's voice Bryony had left in the world. It was Ket who had warned her, on her second night on the sanctuary, precisely how thin the ice was under every provisional's feet. 2 infractions, you go back to the camps, Ket had said, not unkindly, mending a torn sleeve by lamplight. 3, and it doesn't matter how good your reasons were. They don't read reasons off a manifest, love. They read numbers. Bryony had nodded and told herself she'd remember it, and had gone right on breaking the rule anyway, morning after morning, because some things mattered more than the number written next to your name. She thought of Ket's warning now, walking the long corridor toward the matron healer's office with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, the way her mother had taught her to walk into rooms where men, or now, Iskra, held every card. Never let them see you flinch before they've even dealt the hand. Her mother had not lived to see how useful that lesson would become. With her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, the way her mother had taught her to walk into rooms where men, or now, Iskra, held every card. Never let them see you flinch before they've even dealt the hand. Her mother had not lived to see how useful that lesson would become. The office door was Iskra amber glass, frosted with the Wardenate seal, a flame cupped in an open palm, which Bryony had once thought was pretty before she learned what it actually stood for. She knocked. A voice said in the flat, accented trade standard the Iskra used with humans, "Come." Matron healer Achara Kell did not look up from her slate for the first several seconds, which Bryony had also learned was not rudeness but an Iskra habit. They finished a thought before they turned a face toward you, the way a human might finish chewing before speaking. When she did look up, her skin carried the deep violet blue of someone tired down to the bone, mottled faintly gold at the temples in a pattern Bryony had come to recognize. In 11 months of watching Iskra faces the way she used to watch storm clouds, as grief that had gone old and quiet rather than new and loud. "Sit," Achara said, and Bryony sat because that at least cost her nothing. "Under Warden Kass's report says this is your 4th logged unauthorized contact with Bed 41 this cycle," Achara said. 6, if I count the ones he only suspects. 7 if you count today. Something crossed Achara's face, not quite a smile. An Iskra face didn't do smiles the way a human one did, but a small loosening around the eyes that Bryony had learned meant something like reluctant respect. "You're not going to deny it?" "No, ma'am." "Do you understand what Dormant-Unreachable means? Not the policy language." "What it means?" Bryony had heard the policy language enough times to recite it in her sleep. Sustained absence of cortical response, beyond 600 days, constitutes irreversible dormancy under the doctrine of the banked flame. And continued clinical intervention, past that threshold, is understood to prolong suffering in the patient's kin and caregivers, rather than serve the patient. She had also, in 6 weeks of asking every orderly and junior healer who would talk to her, learned what sat underneath it. "It means you think whatever made her asterisk her burned out," Bryony said, "like a coal. And that trying to blow on cold ash is cruel to the people standing around the fire pit, not to the ash." Achara's temples flared a fraction brighter gold, surprise maybe, that a laundry girl had said it back to her more precisely than most of her own junior healers could. "That is, essentially, correct. It is not a comfortable doctrine. It was not written by comfortable people. It was written after the cull, when this Wardenate had 11,000 dormant children in 6 months and not enough healers or hours or hope to keep hoping for all of them equally, and someone had to decide where the mercy actually was. You weren't there for that. I was." "I wasn't," Bryony held her eyes. "I was at Calver's Reach 11 months ago, when the raider ships came in low over the co-op fields, and I watched a building fall on my little brother before I got 30 meters from him. So I know something about deciding where the mercy is, too. I decided it wasn't in giving up on the one thing in front of me that I could still do something about." The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Somewhere down the corridor, a cartwheel squeaked, rhythmic and ordinary, the sound of the sanctuary continuing to run itself regardless of what happened in this office. "Her name is Lark Devane," Achara said finally, reading it off the slate as if she needed the reminder, though Bryony suspected she didn't. 8 years old. Sole survivor recovered from the Devane relief convoy 22 months ago. Concussive trauma destroyed both eardrums and severed optic function bilaterally. She cannot see you, Bryony Achara, and she cannot hear you. And for the last 631 days, no instrument this Wardenate owns has recorded a single voluntary motor response from her that wasn't a reflex. Her family is dead. There is no kin waiting for her to wake, no one to prolong hope for except a laundry girl who has decided, against every finding this facility has made, that she knows better. "I don't know better than your instruments," Bryony said. "I know something your instruments don't measure. I know what her hand does when I trace the same pattern into it every single day for 6 weeks straight, at the same time in the same rhythm, and I know that 4 days ago, for less than 2 seconds, her fingers closed around mine before they let go again. I wrote it down. I know nobody believes a laundry girl's stopwatch. But I was there, and you weren't, and neither was your instrument, because your instrument was 3 meters away recording nothing while I was holding her hand. Achara was silent for a long moment, turning the slate over once in her hands the way a person turns over a coin they don't intend to spend. 2 seconds, she said, out of 631 days. Yes. That is not evidence, child. That is hope wearing evidence's clothes. I have watched 100 grieving staff members mistake the one for the other, and every single time it has cost them more than the doctrine ever did. Then let me get you real evidence. Bryony leaned forward, and for the first time in the conversation her voice shook slightly, not with fear but with the effort of not shouting. Give me until the long ward's transport comes through. That's what, 3 weeks. Give me that, supervised with your own instruments running, and if I'm wrong you can write me up for every infraction on the book and put me on the next transport back to the displacement camps yourself. I won't fight it. But if I'm right, you owe her more than a warehouse for the rest of her life. She hadn't meant to say the last part. It came out anyway, and she watched it land, watched the gold at Achara's temples flare, then bank, the iskra equivalent of a held breath. You know about the transport. Everyone on 7 knows about the transport. Koss isn't as quiet as he thinks he is. Bryony didn't look away. You're consolidating this ward. Dormant-Unreachable cases are being moved off the sanctuary to a long-term care depot on the mainland, so this platform can take the new casualties coming out of the border fighting. Bed 41 is on the list. Achara set the slate down, flat, deliberate. When she spoke again her voice had lost its formal edge, and underneath it Bryony heard, for the first time, something that sounded almost like exhaustion rather than authority. I lost my bond sister in the cull, Achara said. She was dormant for 4 years before I finally signed the release that let her go to the long wards, because I could not keep asking the staff under me to spend hope they didn't have on a case the doctrine had already closed. Do you understand what I am telling you? I am not cruel, Bryony Achara. I am tired in a very specific way that you are still young enough not to be. I would like, more than you know, to be wrong about Lark Devane. I have simply learned not to trust wanting that. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then don't trust it, Bryony said quietly. Trust the log. Put a monitor on her yourself every session, starting tomorrow. Watch it happen instead of hearing about it from a report you can dismiss. If nothing happens in 3 weeks, you'll have lost nothing but 3 weeks of a laundry girl's rest hours, and you can put a clean end to it with your own eyes as proof. But if something does happen, Achara finished, I will have to explain to the entire Wardenate Medical Council why a 17-year-old human refugee with no clinical training succeeded where 600 days of iskra protocol did not. Her mouth did the small, tired, almost smile again. You understand that is not a small thing to ask of me. I'm not asking you to be comfortable, Bryony said. I'm asking you to watch. The transport manifest, Bryony had seen it pinned to the requisitions board in Ward 2, half by accident, half because she had gone looking, listed the long ward's run for the 22nd of the month. That gave her 19 days. Achara Kell looked at her for a long time, the gold at her temples settling slowly back to the deep, tired violet blue it had been when Bryony walked in, and then she picked the slate back up and made a note on it that Bryony couldn't read upside down. 19 days, Achara said. Supervised. My monitor, my hours, my presence at every session I can spare. I want to see this with my own eyes before I put my name on anything. And Achara, if I catch even a suggestion, even the shadow of a suggestion, that you have coached a reflex or staged a response to win an argument with me, I will not simply put you on the next transport. I will make certain no Wardenate facility on this coast ever takes you on again. Do you understand the weight of what I am agreeing to? I understand. Bryony stood, because the meeting had the shape of being over, and something in her chest that had been clenched since Cass's shadow fell across the cot finally, slightly, loosened. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Achara was already looking back down at her slate, already composing whatever note would authorize a monitor and clear a laundry girl's rest hours for 19 days of what her whole professional life told her was false hope. "Thank me if you're right." The monitor was a thin silver disc the size of a coin that a junior healer named Vess pressed to the skin behind Lark's ear the next morning, murmuring readings to a slate as she worked cortical baseline autonomic rhythm, the small vital hum of a body that was, by every reasonable measure, simply waiting. Bryony had expected Vess to hover, to watch her like a child suspected of cheating at cards. Instead, the young healer set the slate on the bedside table, angled so Bryony could see the readout too, and said, not unkindly, "Matron healer says 3 weeks. I'll be here for most of them. Do what you were doing before I walked in." So Bryony did. She had built the language slowly, over 6 weeks that felt now, looking back, like something closer to prayer than method. It had started as almost nothing, a hand held, a thumb moving in slow circles the way she used to soothe her little brother Ison when the sirens ran long, back when the sirens had still meant something you could survive by hiding. Ison had liked patterns. He'd tap them against her wrist in the dark, 3 quick and 2 slow, a nonsense rhyme their grandmother used to say, *1 for the fire, 2 for the door, 3 for the ones who come home once more, until it stopped being a rhyme and became a private code between the two of them, a way of saying I'm here and I'm scared, and it's over now without using a voice the raiders might hear. She had not consciously decided to teach it to Lark. She had simply found herself tracing it, one long slow morning in the 3rd week of her ward rotation, into a small, unresponsive palm, because her hands needed somewhere to put the grief, and Lark's hand happened to be there, and did not pull away. And then she had kept doing it, every day at the same time in the same order, because a girl who had lost her eyes and her ears to a blast wave still had skin, still had nerves, still had. Bryony believed this with a stubbornness she could not fully explain even to herself. A mind somewhere behind that stillness that might, if given the same signal enough times in a row, learn to expect it. 3 quick taps against the base of the thumb, a pause. 2 slow presses against the center of the palm. I'm here. Nothing, Vess said 20 minutes in, checking the readout. Baseline steady. That's fine, Bryony said, and meant it mostly. It's usually fine for a while. She talked while she worked, out of habit more than expectation. Lark couldn't hear a word of it, but Bryony had decided early on that talking helped her own hands stay steady, helped her keep the rhythm from turning into something rote and hollow. She told Lark about the weather, which didn't matter, and about the new batch of laundry soap that smelled like nothing at all instead of the good lavender kind, which also didn't matter, and about Ison, sometimes, when the ward was quiet enough that she trusted her own voice not to crack in front of Vess. He liked counting things, she said on the 4th day, tracing the pattern for the 100th or 500th time. Stones, mostly. He had this whole collection under his bed that Mum kept threatening to throw out. Gray ones mostly, but he had 4 white ones he wouldn't let anyone touch, called them the important ones. Never told me why. 3 taps, pause, 2 presses. I think about that a lot now. What made the white ones important? I never asked him. You don't think to ask, when you figure you've got forever to ask it. Vess, at the foot of the bed, said nothing, which Bryony had also come to appreciate about her. She didn't offer the soft, useless things adults said to grieving children, the "I'm sure he knew you loved him and he's at peace now." She just watched the readout and occasionally made a note. 3 beds down, on the 5th day, a boy named Corin was crying, and it took Bryony a moment to understand that the sound wasn't coming from Corin at all. Corin, 9 years old, Dormant-Unreachable for 411 days after a border skirmish took his parents, and his hearing in the same afternoon, lay as still and unblinking as Lark always had, but from his aunt, sitting at his bedside with a small woven doll pressed against his slack hand, saying his name over and over in a voice that had clearly been saying it, uselessly, for 411 days. Bryony had watched a junior healer named Oris try, gently, to explain the doctrine to her. The threshold, the 600 days, the kindness of not stretching hope past the point it could hold weight, and watched the aunt not hear a word of it, the way grief so often didn't. Bryony had gone to Corin's bedside herself afterward, on her own time, and traced the same 3-tap pattern into his hand that she used with Lark, because it cost her nothing to try and everything to wonder later whether she hadn't. Nothing had come back. Nothing came back the next day either, or the day after that, or in the 5 more days she tried before Cass quietly told her to stop diluting her attention across patients who weren't hers to intervene with. She hadn't stopped because Cass told her to. She'd stopped because on the 11th day she had understood, watching Corin's aunt finally, exhaustedly, stop coming, that some hands really did go still and stay still, that the doctrine had not been written by cruel people guessing wrong but by people who had buried the truth of this exact bedside 1,000 times over and built a wall around it so the next generation of healers wouldn't have to bleed out slowly the same way. It didn't make her stop believing Lark was different. It made her understand, for the first time with her whole chest instead of just her stubbornness, what she was actually asking HFY to risk being wrong about. Corin's transport to the long wards would leave on the 9th day, 10 days ahead of Lark's own scheduled departure. Bryony would stand at the end of Ward 7 that morning and watch 2 orderlies carry him out on a gurney with his aunt's small woven doll still tucked under his slack arm, because no one had had the heart to take it back, and think about Ison's 4 white stones the whole rest of that day without going looking for an answer. Because she had finally understood that some questions you just carried. But that was still 2 days off. On the 7th day, in the middle of all of it, Corin's aunt still coming, still saying his name, Bryony's own hands raw from 6 weeks of a rhythm that had given her exactly 1 contested half-second of hope, Lark's readout blipped. It was small. Vess would later describe it in her own log as a sub-threshold autonomic fluctuation, likely reflexive. The same careful, defensible language every healer in this Wardenate had learned to use around bed 41. But Bryony felt it before she saw the number change, felt the very slight tightening of the small hand around her thumb at the exact moment she pressed the second-to-last beat of the pattern into Lark's palm. Not a grip. Not yet what had happened 4 days before the meeting with HFY. Just a tightening, there and gone, half a second at most. "Did you?" Bryony started. "I saw it," Vess said, and her voice had an edge of something that wasn't quite excitement but wasn't the flat clinical calm from before either. Autonomic spike coinciding with tactile input, it's noted. "Is it enough?" "It's not nothing," Vess said carefully. "It is also not the kind of finding that changes a classification on its own. You know that." Bryony knew that. She kept working. HFY came to Ward 7 for the first time on the 9th day. Not announced, simply present in the doorway one afternoon in a healer's plain gray coat, instead of the formal matron robes Bryony had only ever seen her in behind the amber glass door. She stood at a distance at first, watching Bryony work the pattern into Lark's hand, with the careful, patient repetition of someone who had done it so many times it had stopped feeling like an act and started feeling like breathing. "Tell me what you're doing," HFY said eventually, moving closer, her voice pitched low the way people's voices went low around beds like this one without anyone teaching them to. "Not the readout, the method." Bryony explained it, the rhythm, its origin, the slow accumulation of associated patterns she'd started layering on top of the base signal over the last 2 weeks. A single tap-pause tap now meant *water*, and she traced it against Lark's lips with a damp cloth every time before she gave her a sip through the feeding tube's secondary port, pairing the sign with the sensation the same way you'd teach a very young child a word, by saying it every time the thing itself appeared. A long, slow drag of 2 fingers from wrist to elbow meant cold paired with the moment a blanket got adjusted. She was building a vocabulary the only way she knew how, the way her grandmother, deaf herself since childhood from an illness rather than a war, had once told Bryony families used to do it before any of the fine formal sign languages existed. One signal, one meaning, repeated past the point of boredom, until repetition became expectation, and expectation became, if you were patient and lucky and stubborn enough, something like language. She had a dozen signs by then, though most of them, she admitted to Achara, existed only in her own private log, untested and unconfirmed. A light double tap at the wrist for *sun*, used every morning when she opened the shutter over Lark's bed. A slow press and release at the collarbone for *sound*, used whenever the ward's ambient noise spiked. A bell, a raised voice, though she had no way of knowing whether anything of that concept still meant anything at all to ears that no longer worked. 3 fast presses at the base of the palm, borrowed shamelessly from the I'm here rhythm but quickened, for *hurry*, used on the rare mornings Bryony was running late and wanted, however uselessly, to apologize for it. Most of them she suspected would never be confirmed by anything as clean as an instrument reading. She kept building them anyway, the way you'd keep filling a jar with water you weren't sure had a crack in the bottom, because the alternative was to stop filling it at all, and she had already decided, 6 weeks in, that she would rather be a fool who kept trying than a realist who'd quietly let a child go quiet for good. And if none of it is ever confirmed, Achara asked, if you finish this trial having built an entire private language no instrument will ever verify, what then? Then I'll have spent 6 weeks talking to a little girl instead of ignoring her, same as everyone else in this building has for 2 years, Bryony said. That's not nothing either, whatever the doctrine says about it. It is crude, Achara said, not unkindly, as a formal system. It's not supposed to be formal, it's supposed to be hers. Bryony didn't look up from her work. Anyone can learn a formal system if someone teaches it to them properly, with the right resources in a school built for it. She doesn't have that. She has me in 6 weeks and whatever she still has left in her own head. So I built the smallest thing I could out of the smallest pieces I had, because small is what I've got to work with. Achara watched for a while longer, arms folded, the gold at her temples doing something complicated that Bryony had not yet learned to read. My bond sister loved music, Achara said, apropos of nothing, still watching Lark's still, open-eyed face. Before the call, she used to say that even Iskra, who could not carry a tune, could still feel the floor shake when the choir sang the low notes in the coastal temples. She said the body remembers rhythm even when the mind has stopped attending to it. I did not think of that as clinically relevant information at the time. I filed it as sentiment. Maybe it wasn't just sentiment. Maybe not. Achara's voice had gone very quiet. I will be here for the sessions I said I would be here for, Bryony Achara, not because I believe you are right, because I find that I would rather be wrong about this than certain and absent. She left without saying anything else. Bryony went back to work, and did not let herself think too hard about what rather be wrong meant coming from a woman who had spent the last 4 years being professionally, doctrinally, carefully certain. Koss filed a formal grievance with the Wardenate Regional Council on the 10th day, a fact Bryony only learned about because Vess, furious in the quiet, controlled way Iskra got furious, told her about it herself rather than let her hear it second-hand. The grievance did not name Bryony directly. Koss was too careful an administrator for that, but it named the allocation of monitored clinical hours to an unauthorized intervention on a closed classification case which amounted to the same thing wearing a different coat, and it landed on the desk of a council auditor 2 decks up who had never once set foot in Ward 7, and had no particular reason to care whether Lark Devane's fingers had twitched or not. Achara spent 2 full days Bryony never saw defending the decision in rooms Bryony was never invited into, Vess pieced it together afterward from corridor talk, and a strained half-hour Achara herself admitted to, arguing the case in front of an auditor who kept returning, again and again, to the same simple, damning number. 631 days, a doctrine 6 years settled, a single sub-threshold spike that any first-year healer could be trained to dismiss. Achara did not, in the end, argue that the doctrine was wrong. Vess said she'd never once heard her say that, not once, in the whole 2 days. She argued instead that a matron healer's discretionary authority to run a bounded clinical trial on her own ward, under her own supervision, with her own name attached to the outcome, was not a thing the council had the standing to override on the strength of an administrator's grievance about hour allocation, and that if they wanted to take that authority from her, they were welcome to convene a full disciplinary panel and say so plainly, in writing, rather than let a provisional laborer's rest hours become the excuse. The council did not convene a panel. It also did not close the grievance, which Vess explained grimly was itself a kind of answer, a note left open on a shelf, ready to be pulled down and used the moment anything went wrong. She's spending things on this she can't easily get back, Vess told Bryony, the two of them sitting on the same corridor bench where Vess had once explained the doctrine's mercy to her. Standing, trust with the auditors, the kind of capital that takes years to rebuild once it's spent. I don't think she'd want you to know that. I'm telling you anyway, because I think you should understand what it costs the people who believe you, not just what it costs you to keep believing yourself. Bryony carried that the rest of the day like a stone in her shoe, heavier than Cass's write-ups had ever been, because a write-up only cost her something. This cost someone else. Not everyone on the sanctuary was rooting for her, and it took a knock on the dormitory door 2 nights later, quiet and diffident, for Bryony to understand how far the cost of those 7 logged infractions had spread beyond her own name. Myra 10 worked the same laundry rota Bryony had been pulled off of, a broad-shouldered woman from the same convoy out of Calver's Reach who had shared a supply cart with Bryony's family for 2 days before the raider ships found the co-op fields, though neither of them had known that until they compared stories on the transport 11 months later. Myra didn't come in and sit, the way Ket would have. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry past the nearest cots. You know what happens to a dormitory block when one laborer in it racks up a 3rd infraction, Myra said. They don't just pull you. They review the whole rota. Every provisional in this room gets a black mark next to their name for associated risk, whether we had a thing to do with it or not. Sella's up for a permanent kitchen posting next month. Odom's been trying to get his sister transferred here from the mainland camps for 4 months. You get sent back for a Tier 2 you already know you're sitting on, and it isn't just your file that closes. It's ours. Bryony sat up on her cot, throat tight. I didn't ask any of you to carry that. No, you didn't. Myra's voice wasn't cruel, which somehow made it worse. You also didn't ask any of us before you decided a Dormant-Unreachable case with a locked classification was worth the whole room standing. I'm not telling you to stop. Ket already told me what you'd say if I did, and she's not wrong that I'd probably do the same fool thing in your boots. I'm telling you because you should walk into that ward tomorrow knowing exactly whose names are sitting next to yours on that manifest, not just the girls in the bed. She held Bryony's eyes a moment longer. Whatever you're building in there, Achara, you'd better be right. It isn't only you who pays if you're not. She left before Bryony could answer, which Bryony understood later was its own kind of mercy. Some conversations weren't meant to end in reassurance, only in the truth laid down plainly enough that you couldn't pretend you hadn't heard it. Bryony lay awake a long time after, doing arithmetic she'd been avoiding since the meeting in Achara's office. Not just her own 3-infraction ceiling, but 11 other names sharing a roof with hers, 11 other case files that would list associated risk if she guessed wrong about a little girl's hand. She went back to Ward 7 the next morning anyway. She just held the small hand a little tighter than usual and said nothing to Vess about why. The setback came on the 12th day, and it came the way Bryony had learned setbacks usually did in this ward, sideways, from a direction nobody had been watching. Lark spiked a fever overnight, a lung infection the medical staff traced to aspiration during a feeding, nobody's fault. The kind of thing that happened to bodies that spent all day lying still, and routine enough that Vess assured Bryony it happened to half the long-term patients on the ward at some point. But it meant 3 days of sedation, deep and total, while the infection burned itself out under the Iskra equivalent of antibiotics, and 3 days where the small, unresponsive hand that Bryony had spent 11 days coaxing toward the faintest flicker of response went entirely, chemically slack. Also meant, on the second of those 3 days, that Bryony very nearly lost her monitor coverage entirely. A logistics coordinator named Prell arrived in Ward 7 with a requisition slate of her own, informing Vess that border casualties off the overnight transports had overwhelmed Ward 3's triage capacity, and that every junior healer not assigned to a documented recoverable case was being reassigned, effective immediately, sedated Dormant-Unreachable trials very much included. Bryony understood, watching the two of them argue it out in clipped, careful Iskra procedural language over the foot of Lark's bed, exactly how thin a thread the whole 19-day trial had been hanging from the entire time, not just her own 3-infraction ceiling, but a monitor assignment that belonged, in the end, to a Wardenate with a war still going on outside these walls, and 11 burned children who needed Vess more, in that moment, than a sedated girl who couldn't respond to anything regardless of who was watching. Achara settled it herself, coming down to Ward 7 in person to authorize Vess's temporary reassignment to Ward 3 for the 2 sedated days when no response was possible to miss anyway, on the condition, logged, formal, with her own name against it, that Vess be released back to Bed 41's monitor the moment the sedation lifted, whatever else was still burning on Ward 3 by then. "I can spare her for the days nothing can happen," Achara told Prell, in the flat tone of a woman who had done this arithmetic before and hated it every time. "I cannot spare her for the days something might." It was a small mercy, bought at Achara's own standing rather than Bryony's, and Bryony understood, watching it happen, that she was no longer the only person on this platform spending something she couldn't easily get back. "It's a setback, not a reversal," Vess told her, on the second of those 3 days, finding Bryony sitting in the corridor outside the ward on her break, her knees drawn up, not quite crying but close enough to it that she didn't trust her own voice yet. "The autonomic response we recorded on day 7, that's still in her file. Sedation doesn't erase what already happened. It just means we can't measure what's happening right now." 7 days out of 19, Bryony said. "That's more than a third of what I've got, and I'm losing 3 of them to something that has nothing to do with whether I'm right or wrong." "I know." Vess sat down on the bench beside her, an unusual enough gesture. Junior Iskra healers did not, as a rule, sit on benches next to laundry girls that Bryony looked up. "For what it's worth, I didn't believe you either the first day matron healer Kell assigned me to this monitor. I've read 600 days of this chart. I know what the doctrine says, and I know why it says it, and I know the cull taught this Wardenate that lesson in blood, so I don't think anyone here is a fool for believing it. But I also watched that spike happen with my own instrument, at the exact moment your hand moved, and I don't have a clean way to explain that, a way that doesn't require me to also believe in a coincidence I don't actually think was a coincidence. So what do I do with 3 lost days?" "You make up the rhythm somewhere she can still feel it, even sedated," Vess said, and there was something almost like mischief in it, an Iskra healer quietly suggesting her patient bend a rule she had every professional reason to enforce. "The doctrine doesn't forbid contact during sedation. It just doesn't require it, because nobody expects sedated patients to respond to anything. Nobody's watching that closely. So nobody would stop you." Bryony wiped her face with the heel of her hand, annoyed at herself for how close to crying she'd let herself get in front of a healer she was still, in some careful corner of her mind, trying to impress. "Can I ask you something? Not about the case." "You can ask." "Why do you believe me? Really, not the readout answer. Das has the same readout and he doesn't." Vess was quiet for a moment, turning her own slate over in her hands the way Bryony had seen Achara do. "My clutch brother went dormant when I was young," she said finally. "Not from the war. An accident years before any of this started, a fall, a bleed the Wardenate's medicine at the time couldn't fully repair. He was dormant for 11 years. I grew up visiting a bed that never once, in 11 years, gave me anything back. I became a healer partly because of him, and partly, if I am honest, because becoming a healer was the only way I knew how to keep being allowed near that bed once I was an adult and no longer had a child's excuse for hoping. He never woke. He is still dormant, in a long wards depot 2,000 kilometers from here, and I visit him twice a year, and every single time I trace something into his hand anyway, and every single time nothing answers, and I have made my peace with that being simply true about him." She looked up. "I believe you, Bryony Achara, not because I think every case is Lark Devane. I believe you because I spent 11 years learning exactly what nothing feels like under my hand, and what I felt on day 7, on my own instrument, was not that. I know the difference now. It cost me a great deal to learn it. I would rather use what it cost me than pretend I didn't pay it." Bryony didn't have anything to say to that for a long moment. "I'm sorry about your brother." "So am I. It doesn't mean I'm wrong about this one." Vess stood, smoothing her coat, the moment closing the way Iskra conversations about grief tended to close briskly without lingering, because lingering, Bryony had come to understand, was its own kind of Iskra cruelty to the person still carrying it. "Go back in. Talk to her about the soap again if you have to. Just don't stop." Bryony went back in. She traced the pattern into Lark's slack hand for 20 minutes a day for 3 days, getting nothing back, not even the reflexive twitch, talking the whole time about nothing, about the smell of the bad soap, about a bird she'd seen on the causeway that morning that looked like nothing she remembered from home, about Ison's white stones, which she still hadn't figured out the meaning of and had started to suspect she never would, and that this not knowing, was maybe something she and Lark had in common now. 2 girls carrying questions, with no one left alive to answer them. On the 15th day, the fever broke, the sedation lifted, and Lark's hand, still slack from 3 days of drugs working out of her system, did nothing at all when Bryony traced the old pattern into it. Bryony went back to the laundry that afternoon and scrubbed sheets until her hands ached, because it was the only thing in the building she was allowed to do with her frustration that wouldn't get logged as an infraction. That night Ket Solano found her still awake long after the dormitory lamps had dimmed, sitting on the edge of her cot with her knees drawn up, and didn't ask what was wrong, because after 11 months of sharing a room with her she had stopped needing to. She just sat down on the cot's edge and waited, the way she'd waited out worse nights than this one back at whatever border township she never talked about in any detail Bryony had managed to learn. 15 days, Ket said eventually. In and nothing today, that's what's sitting on you. 4 days left. Nothing today, and I don't know if there's anything left in me for 4 more. Bryony pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. What if Das is right, Ket? What if I've spent 3 weeks convincing myself a coincidence is a conversation because I couldn't stand losing someone else without at least trying? What if that's all this ever was? Could be, Ket said, not unkindly, because she had never once lied to Bryony to make a night shorter. I patched up children on a stretcher line for 6 years before this war put me on a transport instead of a battlefield, and I'll tell you the truth nobody tells you when they're trying to comfort you. Sometimes the ones you want most to save don't get saved, no matter how good your hands are, and no amount of wanting changes the shape of that. I watched it happen more times than I'll ever tell you about. She turned Bryony's chin gently so their eyes met. But I'll tell you the other truth too, the one that doesn't fit as neatly in a lecture. I never once regretted trying past the point it made sense to stop. Not once in 6 years on that stretcher line. I've regretted plenty of things. I've never regretted the trying. You go back tomorrow and the day after and you keep going until the clock actually runs out. Because whatever happens with that girl, you'll be able to live in your own skin afterward. That's worth something on its own, even before you get to whether you're right. Bryony didn't sleep much that night either, but she slept some. And in the morning she went back to Ward 7 with her hands steady. The 16th day brought Das Vrail into the ward, and with him, the argument Bryony had been quietly dreading since the meeting with Achara 19, now 15, days before. Second healer Das was younger than Achara, sharper in the jaw and the temper both, and he had been, Vess told Bryony afterward, one of the 2 junior healers who had helped draft the current doctrine of the Banked Flame revision 6 years ago, back when he was barely more than an apprentice, and the Cull's 11,000 dormant children still weighed on the whole Wardenate like a physical thing. He did not knock. He came into Ward 7, with a slate under one arm and Cass trailing a half-step behind him like a man who knew exactly how this was going to go, and had decided to enjoy it. I've reviewed the monitor logs, Das said, without preamble, standing at the foot of bed 41 with his arms folded. 1 subthreshold autonomic fluctuation in 16 days, followed by a medical setback, followed by nothing. This is precisely the pattern the doctrine predicts for false positive hope investment. I've seen it 11 times in 6 years. It always ends the same way, with staff more devastated than they were before the intervention started, because they let themselves believe there was something to be devastated about losing. With respect, second healer, it's been 16 days out of 19, and 3 of those were lost to sedation that had nothing to do with the method, Bryony said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her something visible, judging by the look Vess gave her. You're asking me to accept a verdict based on a trial you cut short yourself. I am asking you to accept reality before it costs this ward more than it already has. Das's skin had gone a hard, flat slate gray, an iskra color Bryony had not seen before and did not like. Do you know what it costs every day this continues? Not just your rest hours, which are your own to spend foolishly if you choose. Staff hours. Monitor allocation that could be assigned to patients with documented recoverable trauma instead of a case the doctrine settled 2 years ago. Hope, which this facility has learned the hard way, is not an infinite resource, spent on a bet that 6 years of Wardenate medicine says will not pay out. Then let the bet finish, Bryony said. 3 days left. You came in on day 16 to tell me I'm wrong with 3 days still on the clock. I came in on day 16 because Matron Healer Kell is not objective about this case, and someone in this Wardenate needs to be. Das turned to look at Vess, who did not flinch, which Bryony filed away as something to be grateful for later. Healer Vess, your honest clinical assessment, not what the laundry girl wants to hear, what you have actually observed. Vess was quiet for a moment, and Bryony felt her own pulse in her throat, waiting. I've observed one clear autonomic spike coinciding precisely with tactile stimulus, on an instrument I calibrated myself, on a patient with no history of spontaneous autonomic activity in 600 days prior. Vess said finally. I've observed a subsequent absence of further response across a data set contaminated by 3 days of medically necessary sedation, which by the Wardenate's own research standards cannot be counted as a clean negative result. My honest clinical assessment, second healer, is that the sample size is too small and too compromised to support either conclusion you're both trying to draw from it. I think 3 more days changes nothing about the science. I also think cutting it to 0 doesn't either. It just guarantees we never find out. Das's jaw tightened. That is a very careful non-answer, Healer Vess. It's an honest one, Vess said. You asked for my honest assessment. I gave it to you." Das looked at Bryony for a long moment, and something in his flat gray face shifted, not warmth, not quite, but something adjacent to it, a professional's grudging acknowledgement that the argument in front of him was not as simple as the 11 prior cases he'd catalogued in his memory. 3 days, he said. And then this ends, one way or the other, and it is entered into the record cleanly, whichever way it goes, so the next case that comes through this ward doesn't have to relitigate all of this from nothing. Do you understand me? Whichever way it goes. I understand, Bryony said. He left. Cass lingered a moment longer in the doorway, looking, Bryony thought, almost sorry, before he too was gone, and the ward went quiet except for the small mechanical hum of Lark's monitor, and the distant squeak of a cart wheel somewhere down the corridor, the sound of the sanctuary continuing to run itself regardless of what happened in this room. 3 days, Bryony said quietly, to no one, to Lark, to the empty gray afternoon light coming through the ward's high windows. She picked up the small, still hand again and began. The 17th day brought a second, smaller spike, clearer this time, Vess said, cleaner on the instrument, coinciding not with the bass I'm here pattern but with the newer sign Bryony had layered on top of it 2 weeks before. The tap pause tap for asterisk water, traced against Lark's lips a half-second before the damp cloth touched them. A flicker gone as fast as it came, but a flicker in the right place at the right time, twice now in 17 days instead of once. It's still not enough for Das, Vess warned, checking the readout twice to be sure. 2 data points isn't a pattern to a skeptic, it's barely a pattern to me. I know, Bryony didn't stop working, 2 days left. I'm not trying to convince Das anymore, I'm trying to reach her. The 18th day brought nothing. Bryony traced the pattern for 40 minutes, longer than her rest hours technically allowed, until Vess gently reminded her that overstaying twice more would itself become a loggable infraction, doctrine or no doctrine, and Bryony made herself stop, made herself walk away from the small, still hand, with the particular ache of a person leaving a door open behind them that they are not at all sure will still be there to walk back through tomorrow. That night she didn't sleep. She lay on her cot in the laborer's dormitory, staring at the low gray ceiling, running the last 18 days over in her mind the way you'd run your thumb over a scar to make sure it was really there. She thought about Ison's 4 white stones, still unexplained, still hers to wonder about alone now. She thought about her mother's voice. Asterisk never let them see you flinch before they've even dealt the hand, and wondered, for the first time honestly, whether tomorrow was the day she would finally have to. The 19th day was the day the transport was scheduled to leave. It was also, Bryony learned at breakfast from a nervous junior orderly who clearly hadn't meant to be the one to tell her, the day it had been moved asterisk up. Dock congestion on the mainland run meant the long ward's transport would now depart at midday instead of evening, 6 hours earlier than the manifest had said, which left Bryony with a morning instead of the full final day she had been counting on, and no time at all to waste being afraid. She was in Ward 7 before the ward lights had finished their slow dawn brightening, Lark's small hand already in hers, when HFY arrived, not in the plain gray coat this time, but in the formal matron robes, which told Bryony everything she needed to know about what kind of morning this was going to be before a single word was said. Das came in behind her, and Vess, and Cass, and a transport officer Bryony didn't recognize standing uncomfortably by the door with a manifest slate under his arm, clearly aware he had walked into something bigger than his own small piece of it. 6 hours, HFY said, without preamble, coming to stand at the foot of the bed. The transport leaves at midday. I am told there is nothing to be done about that. The mainland dock will not hold the berth. So we have 6 hours, Bryony Achara, instead of the day and a half I promised you, and I am sorry for that, because it was not a promise I broke on purpose. 6 hours is what we've got. Bryony's voice was steadier than she felt. Then let's use it. Before you begin, Das said, I want it stated plainly, for the record, what would constitute proof to this room. Not hope, not a flicker on an instrument that a skeptic could call reflexive. An unambiguous, voluntary, purposeful response. Something that could not be a coincidence of nerve and drug and grief. Something a healer with 60 years of dormancy cases behind him would look at and be unable to explain any other way. Do you understand what I am asking for? I understand. Bryony looked down at Lark's face, still and open-eyed and utterly unchanged by the 6 people now crowded around her bed, the most attention this small room had held in 600 days. I've been building toward exactly that for 6 weeks. I wasn't going to get there by accident. I was building a word. A word, Achara repeated. Her name. Bryony's throat tightened and she let it, because there was no more room left in this morning for pretending she wasn't afraid. I never taught her that one. I taught her water asterisk, cold asterisk, here, small things, useful things, things I could pair with something happening to her body so she'd have a reason to learn them. I never once traced her own name into her hand, because I was saving it. Because if she was ever going to answer anything on purpose, I wanted the first thing she chose to be something nobody could argue was a reflex. Nobody flinches at their own name by accident. Not after 8 years of hearing it, before the blast took that away too. She had built it the way her grandmother once described building a sign named sign. Not the full formal shape a proper deaf education system would have given her, but something small and personal in hers. 3 short taps at the base of the thumb, the way Bryony had opened every single session for 6 weeks, the sign that had already slowly become associated with asterisk presence asterisk, with someone is here, followed, for the very first time this morning, by a slow spiral traced once around the center of the palm. Lark. A shape Bryony had practiced 100 times against her own hand in the dark of the dormitory the night before, to be sure her fingers wouldn't shake when it mattered. The room was silent. Even the cartwheel down the corridor had, for once, stopped squeaking. The tide window closes in 40 minutes, the transport officer said, from the doorway, apologetic and miserable about it in equal measure, the manifest slate hanging forgotten at his side. If she's not aboard by then, the berth's gone until the evening run, and dock congestion means the evening run might not have room for a reclassification at all. I'm sorry. I don't make the schedule. Then we don't need 40 minutes, Achara said, without looking away from the bed. We need one. Bryony took the small hand in both of hers, 3 taps at the base of the thumb. I'm here. A pause long enough that she felt her own heartbeat in it. Then the slow spiral, once careful, deliberate, around the center of the palm. Lark. Nothing happened. She did it again. 3 taps. Pause. The spiral. Beside her she heard Das shift his weight, heard the small sound of a slate being angled to check a readout, heard Achara's breath, held and released, the sound of a woman who had promised herself 4 years ago not to do this again and was doing it anyway. The monitor chose that exact moment to fail her. Signals dropped, Vess said sharply, tapping the slate twice, her 19 days of careful clinical calm cracking for the first time. The disk's contact point, it's shifted, or the adhesives failed. Give me a moment, I need to reseat it. She was already leaning in, careful fingers finding the small silver disk behind Lark's ear, murmuring a recalibration sequence under her breath. A string of Iskra numerals that meant nothing to Bryony except the plain fact that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds might happen for nothing, unrecorded. Exactly the kind of unwitnessed anecdote Das had spent 19 days warning her an instrument would never validate. How long, Achara said, not taking her eyes off the bed. 90 seconds, less if it's just contact and not the disk itself. Vess's hands didn't shake, though her voice had. I need her still. Bryony, don't move her hand, just give me 90 seconds. The transport officer, still in the doorway, looked at his own chronometer and said nothing. which Bryony understood was its own kind of kindness. A man choosing not to be the voice that said the tide window was shrinking while a healer's hands were full. 90 seconds took longer than any of the 19 days that had come before it. Bryony held the small, still hand loosely. Carefully, the pattern paused mid-breath and watched Vess's fingers work the disc back into contact with a precision that looked, to Bryony's untrained eye, indistinguishable from prayer. "Readings back," Vess said finally, something like relief cracking through the clinical flatness. "Clean signal, go." Third time, 3 taps, pause. The spiral, slower now, Bryony's own hand starting to shake despite everything, despite her mother's voice in her head telling her not to flinch. The small fingers closed. Not around Bryony's hand this time, not the reflexive half-second grip from day 7, not a flicker gone before the instrument could fully register it. The fingers closed slowly, deliberately, around Bryony's thumb and held 3 full seconds, 4, 5, and then, impossibly carefully, they began to move. 3 small presses against the base of Bryony's thumb. A pause. And then, faint but unmistakable, a slow, small, circular drag against the center of Bryony's palm, the shape traced back the exact wrong way around. The clumsy, uncertain mirror image of a girl trying, for the first time in 631 days, to say a name back. "Oh," Vess said, very quietly, and Bryony realized distantly that the healer's voice had cracked. "That is not a reflex," Doss said. His voice had gone strange, stripped of its earlier flatness entirely. He was staring at the readout on his own slate, then at the bed, then back at the readout, as if his eyes and his instrument were arguing with each other, and he did not yet know which one he trusted less. "That is the response initiated after the stimulus ended. That is a delay consistent with retrieval, with a deliberate chosen." He stopped. He was, Bryony understood in that moment, a man watching his own 6 years of careful, defensible, doctrine-shaping certainty come apart in real time, and finding that he did not, in fact, resent it. "Do it again," Achara said. Her voice was not steady at all. "Please do it again." Bryony did it again, 3 taps, pause, the spiral, and this time the response came faster, still clumsy, still uncertain, but faster, the small fingers pressing back with something that was unmistakably, undeniably effort. Lark's face did not change. Her open, unseeing eyes stayed fixed on the same nothing they had been fixed on for 600 days. But her hand was working, was reaching, was trying, in the only language she had left in all the world, to say the one word that had been waiting for her, patiently, every single morning for 6 weeks. Achara Kell stood very still at the foot of the bed for a long moment, watching, the gold at her temples flaring bright enough that even Bryony, still learning to read Iskra faces, understood exactly what it meant. Then she turned to the transport officer still waiting uncertainly by the door. "Bed 41 is withdrawn from the manifest," she said. Her voice had recovered its formal edge, but underneath it now was something that had not been there 19 days ago. "Effective immediately. You will amend the record and inform the mainland depot there has been a reclassification. Matron Healer, the doctrine requires a full clinical review before any Dormant-Unreachable case can be." "I am aware of what the doctrine requires," Second Healer Doss, "because I helped write it." Achara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "And I am telling you, as the officer with the standing to say so, that we are about to begin that review today, with every instrument this sanctuary owns. Because I have just watched a 631-day dormant patient answer to her own name for the first time since the Devane convoy fell, and I will not be the healer who let a docking schedule decide whether that mattered." The transport officer, still standing uncertainly in the doorway with his manifest slate, looked at the small hand still working slowly against Bryony's palm, and made his own note without being asked, quietly, the small human decency of a man who had clearly not expected his morning to end this way. "Kas, who had come to Ward 7 that morning half expecting to escort a laundry girl off the platform for good, said nothing at all. Bryony watched his flat administrator's face cycle through something that was not quite an apology, would probably never become one, but had at least stopped being certain of itself. Vess was openly crying, unashamed of it in a way Bryony had not seen from her in 6 weeks of careful clinical composure, wiping at her face with the back of one sleeve while she kept the monitor running with the other hand, because whatever else this morning was, it was also, for her, 11 years of a different bedside finally allowed to exhale. "Second healer," Achara said, quieter now, turning to Das. "I would like your name on the review request as well as mine. Not because I doubt my own standing to file it alone, because I think this Wardenate needs to see the two of us agreeing on something, for once, before it will believe either of us." Das looked at the small hand still moving, still reaching, still trying, and something in his flat gray face settled into a decision. "You'll have it," he said. The clinical review took 11 weeks, not the 3 days Das had once predicted would settle the matter one way or another. Bryony learned over those 11 weeks that being right did not mean the fight was over. It meant the fight changed shape. From asterisk convinced them to look to the slower, harder work of teach them what they were looking at. She spent her mornings in Ward 7 and her afternoons, at Achara's insistence, and against every instinct that told her provisional laborers did not get invited into clinical staff meetings, sitting at the edge of Wardenate review sessions explaining, patiently, the small vocabulary she had built one paired signal at a time, so that the healers documenting Lark's slow, halting, unmistakably real recovery would have a common language to work from instead of having to reinvent it from nothing. The regional auditor who had kept Kass's grievance open on his shelf for 11 weeks, waiting, as Vess had predicted, for a reason to pull it back down, came to the sanctuary in person during the 4th week of the review. A spare, unhurried Iskra named Fenar Osk, who introduced himself to Bryony with the careful neutrality of a man who had not yet decided whether he was there to close a loophole or apologize for one. He watched a session. He said almost nothing through the whole of it, standing at the back of Ward 7 with his arms folded, while Bryony traced the by then familiar rhythm into Lark's hand, and Lark, faster every week, traced something back. Afterward he asked Bryony exactly one question, not about the method, not about the science, but about the 6 weeks before anyone official had believed her. Why keep coming during those 6 weeks, when nothing but your own conviction told you it mattered? Bryony had thought about lying, about giving him the clean answer a provisional laborer was supposed to give an auditor. She gave him the true one instead. "Because I already know what it costs to stop reaching for someone before you're sure there's nothing left to reach. I wasn't going to make that mistake twice in one lifetime if I could help it." Osk had written something on his own slate, closed the grievance the same afternoon without further comment, and left on the evening transport. Kass did not raise the matter again. The closest the whole review came to collapsing outright arrived in the 6th week, in a chamber Bryony had never been inside before and would have been happy never to see again. A high, cold, amber-glassed room 2 decks above the matron healer's office, where the Regional Medical Council convened in person only for matters it judged serious enough to warrant leaving their own wards. Achara had warned her the night before that this session would be different from the small review meetings she'd grown used to sitting at the edge of. "This is not people who have already half decided to believe you," Achara said. "This is Elder Healer Vantor Rue, who chaired the committee that wrote the banked flame doctrine after the call, and who has spent 6 years defending it against exactly this kind of case. Be precise. Be calm. Do not let him make you perform your grief for him. He has seen a great many people do that, and it has never once changed his mind." Vantor Rue turned out to be an old Iskra, skin gone a pale, powdery violet with age, whose 4-fingered hand stayed folded in his lap the entire time Achara presented the 6 weeks of accumulated data, the growing vocabulary, the widening latency window, the second and third, and by now dozens of confirmed autonomic responses timed precisely to tactile stimulus. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked, in a voice that carried no heat at all, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have, "And how many dormant children, in the 6 years since the doctrine you are asking me to unwrite was adopted, were spared the kind of prolonged, false hope intervention this girl is describing? How many families were permitted to grieve cleanly, on a fixed and honest timeline, instead of being told to keep hoping past the point hoping could do anything but hurt them?" "I don't know the number," Bryony said, before Achara could answer for her, because she had promised herself in the corridor outside that she would not let anyone else carry this part. "I know it's not 0, and I know the doctrine did that on purpose, for good reasons, and I'm not standing here telling you it was wrong to write it. I'm telling you it drew the line in one place, 6 years ago, with the information you had then. I'm asking you to look at what one case can add to that information now." One case. Elder Healer Rue's temples didn't so much as flicker. Whatever passed for surprise in a man that old apparently required more than a 17-year-old laundry girl contradicting him. "You understand that a policy built around a single exceptional case is not policy. It is superstition wearing policy's clothes." "Then don't build it around one case," Bryony said. "Build it around the 100-day trial the matron healer is proposing. Run the same way for every Dormant-Unreachable patient going forward, measured the same way, with the same instruments, so that if I'm the only one it ever works for, you'll know that cleanly too, and you can close the door on it with real numbers instead of a 6-year-old guess. I'm not asking you to believe Lark Devane is a miracle. I'm asking you to stop assuming in advance that she can't be anything else." The chamber was quiet long enough that Bryony heard her own pulse in her ears, the way she had at the foot of Lark's bed on the 19th day. Das, seated near the back with the review's accumulated files stacked in front of him, spoke into the silence before Rue could answer. "Elder Healer, with respect, I drafted half of the language you're defending. I believed, for 6 years, that I understood exactly where the mercy sat in this doctrine. I no longer believe that with the certainty I once did, and I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because a child moved my heart. I say it because I have a data set now that the doctrine's authors did not have in front of them, and I think refusing to look at it because it is inconvenient to the certainty we built our careers on is not caution. It is cowardice wearing caution's clothes." A pause, and something almost apologetic crossed his flat gray face, aimed, Bryony understood, at the old Iskra who had likely taught him half of what he knew. "I would rather be the healer who revised his own doctrine than the one who let it calcify past the point it could still learn anything." Elder Healer Rue looked at Das for a long moment. His own student, Bryony would learn afterward, one of the 2 apprentices he'd hand-picked to help draft the revision 6 years before, and something in the old healer's pale, powdery face shifted. Not agreement exactly, but the visible cost of a man choosing to let a door stay open that he had spent 6 years believing was better shut. "The council will not vote on a full revision today," Rue said finally. "It will vote on whether the 100-day trial protocol may proceed to a formal pilot on this sanctuary under Matron Healer Kell's direct supervision, reviewed again in 6 months with real numbers instead of one girl's hand." He looked, for the first time, directly at Bryony. "That is not the victory you came here for, child. It is the only one I am prepared to give you today." "It's enough," Bryony said and meant it. The vote, when it came an hour later, was 7-4 in favor of the pilot. It was not, Achara told her afterward, walking back down through the long amber-glassed corridors toward Ward 7, a large margin as these things went. It was, however, a margin which 6 weeks ago had not existed at all. Lark did not wake up whole. Bryony had known, somewhere under the hope that she wouldn't. The eyes stayed dark, the ears stayed silent, and the girl who slowly, over those 11 weeks, learned to reach for Bryony's hand unprompted instead of only in response to the old rhythm, was going to spend the rest of her life navigating a world she could only touch, never see or hear. But she reached. By the 4th week, she was initiating the "I'm here" sign on her own, small questing fingers finding Bryony's hand before Bryony had even finished sitting down at her bedside. By the 7th week, a specialist Iskra tactile language instructor, a discipline that existed, it turned out, mostly for Iskra whose bioluminescent sensing organs had been damaged in accidents, but whose principles translated, with patience and cross-species care, almost perfectly to a blind, deaf human girl, had begun formally expanding the small, crude vocabulary Bryony had built into something that might, in a year or two, actually deserve to be called a language of Lark's own. Das Vrale, to Bryony's lasting surprise, became one of the review's most rigorous advocates for revising the doctrine of the banked flame's 600-day threshold. Not because he had become sentimental, he told her once, gruffly, in a corridor outside a review session, but because he had spent 6 years believing the doctrine protected patients from false hope, and Lark Devane had just shown him, with an unambiguous, delayed, deliberate signal his own instruments could not explain away, that in at least some fraction of cases it might instead be protecting the doctrine from the inconvenience of trying harder. "I do not think every dormant case is Lark Devane," he told her, in the flat, careful tone he used for things he had thought about a great deal before saying. "I think most of them, tragically, are exactly what the doctrine says they are. But I no longer believe we know cleanly in advance which is which. That is a harder thing to build a policy around than a fixed number of days. It is, I have come to think, the more honest one." The Wardenate Council's final review, 11 weeks after the morning the transport almost left without Lark Devane on it, revised the doctrine's threshold from a fixed diagnostic cutoff to a mandatory extended contact trial, 100 additional days of structured, monitored tactile intervention, run by trained staff working from a documented individualized communication method, before any Dormant-Unreachable classification could be finalized. It would not save every case. Achara said as much plainly, the day the revision passed, standing in front of the assembled Ward 7 staff with a formality that didn't quite hide how tired and how relieved she looked in equal measure. Some flames really had gone out, and no amount of patient breath would relight them, and the Wardenate's healers would have to learn to carry that grief alongside the new hope without letting either one crowd the other out. But some had not gone out. Some had simply been waiting in the dark for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to keep showing up. Bryony asked, the same week the revision passed, whether the new 100-day trial could be applied retroactively to cases already transferred to the long wards depots, and was told, gently, by Achara herself, that the honest answer was some. Not all. The depots were reviewing their own rosters now under the new standard case by case, and it would take months. And there was no way to know in advance which small, stilled hands still had 100 days of trying left worth spending on them, and which didn't. Bryony wrote to Corin's aunt anyway, the address copied carefully from an old ward file with Vess's quiet help, not promising anything, just telling her the doctrine had changed, and that someone would be looking at her nephew's case again with fresh eyes and more patience than it had gotten before. She never learned, in all the months that followed, whether that letter changed anything for Corin himself. She learned, instead, to live with not knowing, the way she had learned to live with Ison's 4 white stones, not as an answer she owed herself, but as a door she had at least made sure was left open, for someone else's stubbornness to walk through if it turned out there was still time. Achara offered Bryony a formal position on the sanctuary staff the same afternoon, not laundry and kitchen rota, but a newly created role, tactile communication aid *, with training, with a wage, with a Wardenate badge instead of a refugee patch. Bryony said yes before Achara had finished the sentence, and then, because her mother had also taught her not to let anyone see how much a thing mattered to her until the ink was dry, waited until she was alone in the corridor afterward to let herself cry, for the first time in 11 months, without trying to stop it. 6 months after the morning the transport nearly left, Bryony sat on the edge of Lark's bed, no longer bed 41 in anyone's paperwork, just Lark's bed, in a ward that had slowly, deliberately, stopped being a place where children waited to be reclassified and started being a place where they were taught, and traced a new pattern into the girl's outstretched, waiting hand. Lark had grown 2 centimeters. She had started in the last month, making small sounds of her own sometimes, wordless and rough, the first attempts of a voice that had gone unused for 2 years finding its way back into a throat that remembered, distantly, how it used to work. Her tactile vocabulary now ran past 200 signs, taught by a proper instructor with proper training, but she still, every single morning, reached for Bryony first and traced the same 3-tap greeting Bryony had traced into her palm on the very first day, 6 months and a lifetime ago. "I'm here," Lark signed unprompted, her small fingers sure now quick, entirely her own. "I know," Bryony signed back, the new sign for it, one they'd built together in the 5th month, a slow double press she liked better than any formal sign the instructor had offered because it was theirs. "I'm here too." Outside the tall windows of Ward 7, the causeway gulls wheeled over gray water that had once seemed, to a girl who arrived on this platform with nothing but a refugee patch and 11 months of grief she didn't know what to do with, like the edge of the whole ruined world. It didn't look like that anymore. Bryony still thought about Ison sometimes, still didn't know what made his 4 white stones important, still carried that unanswered question the way she carried everything now, not as a wound she picked at, but as a small, steady weight she had learned to hold without letting it hold her still. She had come to this sanctuary broken in a way she hadn't had a word for yet, certain that whatever in her used to know how to hope had burned out somewhere over Calver's reach along with everything else. It turned out that wasn't true either. It had just been waiting, patient in the dark, for someone to keep tracing the pattern until it remembered how to answer. Lark's fingers moved again, tracing a new shape against Bryony's palm, one the instructor had taught her only that week, slow and careful and entirely deliberate. The sign, still clumsy in a small hand still learning its own strength, for *stay. Bryony pressed back, 3 taps and a hold, the oldest word in their whole small language, the one she had never once, in 631 days of silence or 6 months of slowly returning sound, stopped being willing to say. "I will,"